So last time I read some stuff from this book and I forgot to show you the book. This is called The Evolution of Cooperation by Robert Axelrod. I'm just going to pitch the book really fast. I thought very seriously about requiring you to read it for this class because when I took an AI class, I was required to read this book and I really enjoyed it. So I almost did, and then I decided, nah, you guys get more out of the programming assignments than out of reading assignments anyway. So I opted not to do the diversity thing, but if this Christmas you decide, hey, I sure had fun in that AI class, I wish I could just have a little more, go get this book and read it. It's really light reading. It's not like a textbook. It's kind of like, it's almost more like a novel. It's lots of fun, and I found when I read this book in my AI class, it really piqued my interest in a lot of game theory topics, and I think it would be a good, worth your time investment to pick one of these up and spend a little time reading it. There's probably an ebook out there. You can listen to it in your car, etc. The Evolution of Cooperation by Robert Axelrod. There you go. I've pitched the book to you. And I am not a co-author. I don't get any money for this or anything like that. I actually just think it's a good book. We were talking a bit about altruism and why I think that intelligence promotes cooperation. I wanted to point out a few cases in biology that I neglected to mention last time. Anybody know about mitochondria? The powerhouse of the cell, exactly. So mitochondria are these little organelles. You know what an organelle is? It's basically the analog of an organ for the cell, right? Little tiny organ. Hey, so mitochondria have their own DNA, and that's actually really significant. And that kind of told an important story in how mitochondria came about. The fact that they have their own DNA, what does that imply? Probably billions of years ago, they were separate creatures, right? And in fact, it's believed, I don't know if we know this, but we just have some evidence, that they used to be parasites. The mitochondria, or at least the distant ancestors of mitochondria, would actually invade cells and steal their energy. Don't know what happened, but somehow, now here they are, sitting in the middle of our cells, generating energy. There was some kind of switch at some point, or there must have been, from being parasitic to being symbiotic, where the mitochondria entered into the cell, like it does to steal the energy, and then decided, hey, let's just sit here and work with the cell and help it generate energy. No idea how that happened, but look what it did. All of a sudden, we went from having these prokaryotic cells that are very simple and don't have any organs in them, to eukaryotic cells, which are actually these cells within cells within cells, and they have, now our cells have Golgi bodies and vacuoles and mitochondria and ribosomes. See how many organelles I can name. It has been a long time since I took 9th grade biology. Basically, eukaryotic cells are much, much bigger. They contain a whole bunch of smaller things that are like unto the simple prokaryotic or archaea cells that preceded them, but they were much more effective, right? Animal cells are all these eukaryotic cells, these complex ones that have organelles within them that all work together in some kind of a cooperative system. And essentially, the way I like to think of it is that which is cooperation or organization at the level of the organelle, all these organelles working together, is really what's best for the cell as a whole, right? So it's almost self-interestedness from the perspective of the cell to have its organs all working together. Well, if you fast forward a little bit through history, then you find a whole bunch of eukaryotic cells start clumping together and forming these cell mats. If you look at these multicellular organisms, do you see that a bunch of cells working together, kind of cooperating or being altruistic, is self-interestedness at the level of the multicellular organism? And then if you have a whole bunch of cells working together to form an organ, aren't you glad your heart and your brain and your lungs are all cooperating and working together? Yeah. Right? Yeah, otherwise you'd be dead. And it's very beneficial for your body as a whole. You could say it's in your self-interest for your organs to be selfless. They're all cooperating. It would really stink if your heart cells said, this job sucks. I'm going to grow hair or something instead. That'd be very bad for your life. I think it naturally follows that it's intelligent to in order to get to the next level to try to achieve cooperation. And then if we get to all the way up to the level of the human, what do we find? Has anybody ever heard of the triune brain model? Now, to be clear, this is a neuroscience model, and to be clear, it's not accepted as being true. It's accepted as being a model that kind of characterizes some of the things that happen in the mind. It's really more about the mind than the brain, honestly. But it was a very significant model for helping neuroscientists to finally make some sense out of what's going on in the brains. So the idea here is that there's this evolutionary history reflected in your brain. They call it the reptilian complex. I'll just call this the mammalian complex. And they say neo-mammalian. Usually I hear it called the primate complex. But here's the basic gist of it. Reptiles are these very self-interested creatures, right? Imagine dinosaurs, they lay their eggs, and then what do? Well, we don't know for sure, but presumably they just abandon the eggs and they go hunt for food. And they're thinking about themselves because they're reptiles. That's what they do. And that's why there's eggs, is the eggs leave everything that the baby needs to survive and come forth. So reptiles are very self-interested, and the idea is, hey, deep in our minds, we have this part of our mind that's very focused on ourselves, and we call that the reptilian complex. About 60,000 years ago, give or take, the meteor hit near the city of Chicxulub in the Yucatan Peninsula, made a big extinction event, made life really hard for the reptiles, and most of the reptiles died. Why? Because they didn't take care of each other, right? Presumably. We don't know that, but we're speculating that's why it happened. In the fossil record at that time, the mammals just surged they surged forward. Why? Well, I guess there weren't as many dinosaurs eating all the mammals anymore because the reptiles were dying off as they were very self-interested. Mammals have a different property. They take care of their families. Imagine a pack of wolves. They all hunt together, right? Because it's better for the pack. The characteristic property of mammals is that the mother sits around and takes care of their young. Is that good for the mother? Well, it's good that her mother took care of her, and she pays it forward and takes care of her children and so forth. And so apparently when you band together, you form a larger organism that, this by cooperation, it's better for the entity as a whole. So the whole idea of families is kind of characterized in mammalian behavior. And humans are not just self-interested reptiles. We also tend to form social groups, right? We tend to band together and take care of one another. We tend to care about each other. And the more we do, we tend to think that's good, right? That's positive, more intelligent. And it's kind of considered less intelligent to run off and go seek after only your own interests. This neo-mammalian complex, or the primate complex, is characterized by the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. The idea is that it allows logic and reasoning and rational thought. But I like to think about logic and reasoning and rational thought and intelligence as all kind of going together in promoting what makes sense, what's overall for the greater good. Whereas mammals tend to be very tribal, as in our tribe is the best and your tribe is the worst. When you start using reasoning and logic, there starts to become more of this general purpose altruism. I like to think of the founding fathers of the United States as being very logical individuals. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. But they established this Constitution. Why? Presumably because they wanted a great country. Not because they were thinking about themselves. They didn't write in benefit for their own families. It was kind of just imagining, hey, what would make a really strong country, and wouldn't the country be best for everyone else? You see how that's logical, rational, and yet it's also kind of altruistic and hyper-cooperative. So the message I'm trying to get here is, hey, look, we have these brains, and there may or may not really be a reptilian and mammalian and primate complex in our brains, but it does, at least to some extent, characterize the way we think. And the more humans tend to use their primate complex and the less we rely on our reptilian complex, the more we seem to accomplish good things. Here we are in a school, we've built the internet, we write computer programs, we're taking an AI class. This is all very characteristic of the primate complex of your brains. So what I'm saying here is this fits in very well with the whole idea that cooperation tends to evolve, and the more there's cooperation, the more it tends to be better for the next level of life. To draw another analogy from that, what does that make us relative to the whole life of society? Do you see how, to an extent, you're a cell? I'm trying to say, I think human beings are very much cells in a larger life. And if you want to think of it that way, hey, you know, you're not the only thing that matters. As much as you might think, hey, I'm getting an education, I'm here benefiting myself. Well, you're also part of a society that's doing great things, that's, you know, bigger than you are, and that has a life that will live after yours is ended. Does that not give you a certain amount of purpose, a certain amount of function? Just as you want your heart cells to keep on pumping because they're part of that cooperation is what gives you life. Well, to the extent that you are here getting an education and you're going to go do your job really well, to the extent that you're being an effective, productive part of society, aren't you strengthening a life that's bigger than your own? It's not all about you. There's all kinds of really good things to do in this world. There's really good reasons to be a little bit cooperative, a little bit altruistic, and I hope we can recognize that, you know, it really is more advantageous to start suppressing the self-interested parts of ourselves and start being a little bit cooperative. It tends to lead to greater intelligence, at least at the higher level, I believe. And now if we can imagine some type of galactic society where each planet is now an organ in the life of the society. You remember I started this whole class by pointing out that I claim the internet is the nervous system of society or of the earth. Well, as silly of an analogy as that may seem, I kind of think it's actually a surprisingly good analogy in that these patterns of life really do emerge, and there it is. You can't deny how much that looks like a brain. It really does. And I think that there's a reason for that. I think the reason is that intelligence follows patterns. And if we can recognize these patterns, we can probably make greater intelligence emerge. And so kind of that's what this class is about, is we're trying to recognize the fundamental patterns of intelligence so that when we start applying them, maybe we'll get emergent behaviors that are greater and more meaningful and important than the actual program itself. Let's talk about emergent phenomena. So an argument I often hear against AI is this. They'll say, or against consciousness, against artificial consciousness, is we as humans don't understand consciousness. Therefore, we cannot implement it. How do you feel about that argument? Yeah, we don't understand consciousness, therefore there's no way we can implement it until we do. So when people say we can't implement something that we don't understand, I implemented chess, right? And do I understand chess? Yeah, I'm pretty good at it. I taught my children to play. In fact, my daughter just won a third place at a chess tournament recently, and I was proud of her. And that's kind of cool. But you know what? I also implemented alpha-beta pruning, and it beats me at chess. Isn't that kind of phenomenal that I could write something that's better than I am? Wait a minute, did I implement something that's greater than I could understand? Well, no, because I just took advantage of the fact that the machine's friggin' fast. I could sit there in a chess game and systematically, with volumes of paper and a pen, do alpha-beta pruning and beat my opponents, right? Except no, because they'd never sit there and endure that. I'd never do it. I don't have the patience. In essence, it really did buy power to utilize a machine. What I do understand is alpha-beta pruning. It's really just minimax with skipping a few trees, right? Or a few branches. And so, in a sense, we all are better chess players than we are. Because we know this algorithm that plays great chess, and it's a super simple algorithm, isn't it? That's it. I mean, that is not a lot of code. And the truth is, most of this is just for efficiency's sake. If we looked up the minimax code, it's even simpler than that. And it's really just that principle applied, and what happens is intelligence emerges. All of a sudden, this thing is sacrificing its queen in order to
take advantage and an advantageous position in the game, which will eventually lead to a checkmate. And if you think, do I understand that strategy? Not a chance, right? But I do understand alpha-beta pruning. And so I kind of feel like intelligence is not something that we need to understand. Intelligence is an emergent phenomenon of some really basic principles. And those basic principles, I think, are learning and decision-making and kind of the core algorithms we're really studying in this class. And I feel like if we get them right, intelligence itself will be this emergent phenomenon that ends up being surprisingly complex and hard to understand and in many ways unfathomable, even though it's really just a loop repeating this very simple recursive code or something like that. So if somebody ever tells you, hey, we don't understand consciousness, so we can't implement it, you can say, hey, I don't understand all kinds of strategies that my AI has used against me. My research area is deep learning, and these deep learning models we consider to be black boxes. We know how they work because we built them, but we don't know how they work. Meaning, inside it's so much math that no human being can comprehend it. We know how to train these things. We develop the algorithms that train them, so we can reduce them to a simple mathematical equation. And by simple, I mean it would take up pages and pages of, I could print it on the screen and it wouldn't fit. So yeah, it is in many ways incomprehensible, and yet we built it. So I guess that's the principle of emergent phenomena, is when you start getting things working together, you get these symbiotic relationships, you get these chaotic effects, you get all kinds of behaviors that are hard to anticipate, and you can get behaviors that are surprisingly incomprehensible and appear to be highly intelligent. So I think that this assignment is proof that, hey, look, we can build something greater than we understand as long as we get the right principles and figure out what leads to intelligence. So that's kind of what we're trying to do now, is figure out, hey, we've got these brains. They have 80 billion neurons in them with over 100 trillion synaptic connections. Think about that. That is a lot. 100 trillion synaptic connections. That is so many different places where the axons of the neurons connect with the dendritic fibers of other neurons. And somehow encoded in all of that is what your brain does. No way we could get that right. But all of that complexity is driven by your DNA, which is much simpler, relatively speaking. And all of that DNA is really reduces down to just a bunch of patterns encoded in these nucleotides, right? And at some point, it looks like we just have some basic learning and decision-making algorithms that are somehow implemented in all of that. If we could tease it out, we could probably figure out why we're intelligent, how it works, and what to do with it.